Well, hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church in Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason. I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and on behalf of our church family, welcome. We're thrilled to be connecting with you for this study. Hopefully you're a regular with us, but possibly if you're new, you might ask this your question. Why do we call it 316? Well, we are connected to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, where we always want to be studying because God's word is useful and profitable for so many different things, for equipping us for all that God has called us to do. And so in these studies, we like to go verse by verse, or if we're doing a summary to understand some context, to go at passages in verse by verse, even though it might be in sections. And in this study, we're in a complete series on the prophets. Previously, we did the major prophets of the Old Testament, and in this study, we've been going through the 12 minor prophets. And today we find ourselves in new territory. That's because we're getting to the end. We're dealing with the book of Haggai today. And so these final three Old Testament prophets are unique from the others. In all of the others, from the major prophets to the earlier minor prophets, those first 9, they're all dealing with either captivity coming or captivity happening. Where we are in Haggai, and then we'll be looking at Zechariah and Malachi, they are post-exile prophets. So Babylon has fallen, Assyria had fallen years before to the Babylonians, but now the Babylonians have fallen to the Persians, and the Persians are actually going to be the ones who release a portion of the Hebrews or the Jewish people to return back to Jerusalem, to rebuild temple, to rebuild wall, to reestablish themselves. And Haggai is going to have an important role in all of this. So switching over to our look, one of the things with the book of Haggai is that it's fairly unique because it's only 2 chapters. It's a very short writing, but it has significance. And we're going to lean on some context that I think helps you understand Haggai chapter 1 and chapter 2. So the first thing is that his name means festive or feast. Now, scholars will wrestle with, does this mean that he was born in the time of one of the mandatory feasts? Is this a time that he was pointing back to the return to not just temple, but to these main holidays? There's a variety of different angles that could be discussed and considered, but we'll just say that his name means what it means, and that is that it means feast or festive. Now, what I want to angle on in our study is his contemporary, because his contemporary helps us understand so much. And his contemporary, his writing contemporary, I should say, is Ezra. Ezra, the book of Ezra, offers so much help for us for understanding the context of the book of Haggai, and then the book of Haggai and Zechariah will complement Ezra, and you'll see that as we go. So let's kind of walk through some context to get to our writing. First, we want to understand and remember that Jeremiah, when captivity was coming from the Babylonians, Jeremiah had prophesied that this captivity would last a period of 70 years. Now, we won't go into components as to why or what that is pointing to. There are a number of theories to that. We're just going to say that he prophesied that it would be 70 years, and that time has expired. Babylon had fallen to the Medo-Persian Empire. If we want to read some of the detailing of that, we can read in the book of Daniel, because once again, just like Daniel and Ezekiel were both in the midst of captivity, they were prophets amongst the exile. So we can read about the fall of Babylon, and we can read about the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. But the king at time, for where we're going to be looking, is King Cyrus. He's the king of Persia at the time, and he's going to be the one that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Now, he's going to send them to Jerusalem for one of two primary objectives. As people would return to Jerusalem to reestablish themselves, there would be two fundamental things to the Jewish people that would be necessary. The temple would be number one, and the wall around Jerusalem for their safety would be number two. We've talked before in past conversations that in ancient towns, walls were critical. They were critical to their protection. They were also even critical to their provisions. And the first thing for the Jewish people, though, instead of building a wall, is to build the temple. Why? Because God is their protection. And the first thing that they ought to do is return to worship. And for them, in a time period, that meant sacrifices. So if you were to rebuild the temple first, then the first thing inside the temple you would want to build is the altar so that sacrifices to the Lord could return. We'll push on that in just a bit. God is going to eventually commission Haggai to motivate the Jewish people that were in Jerusalem or in that surrounding area to complete the construction on the temple because it had stymied. Now, on this kind of side path, if this is a road, if this is a path we're on tonight with Haggai and Ezra, you will see so many parallels on a side road going very close to it with Nehemiah. Nehemiah is going to be called by God to help motivate the rebuilding of the wall because that had stymied. The building of the temple had stymied. The building of the wall had stymied. And so our study is not Nehemiah, but you will see some parallels. So let's look at the book of Ezra before we ever get to Haggai. So in the book of Ezra, we have 10 chapters, and I've just highlighted the first 6 chapters here for you. King Cyrus is going to allow for the exiles to return home. There's going to be about 50,000 Jews that will return for this project of rebuilding the temple. Number 2, we won't look at anything in this. There's going to be a list of the returning exiles. The third thing chapter 3 is the first thing they're going to do is rebuild the altar and then begin work on the temple. 4, opposition to that building. And it's going to be just like Nehemiah. Nehemiah, he begins construction on the wall, and what follows immediately is opposition to it. God's going to raise up Haggai and Zechariah. We're going to deal with Zechariah next week. And then we'll see also that in chapter 6 that Darius is the king of Persia. That's going to be important for understanding that time has changed. You have Cyrus who begins this, but by the time there's completion, Cyrus is long gone. It's Darius. And so there's an important factor there that we'll lean on in the book of Haggai. So still staying in Ezra, it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, that's the 70 years, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout the realm and to put it in writing. And verse 2 says, this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of earth, and he's appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord. Now pause, let me push on a couple of things here. One, Cyrus is using some of the language of the Jewish people, even though they're exiles in Babylon. Well, now the Babylonians were displaced also. So the Persians, though, did not fully bring everything into that area right away. They had been populating elsewhere. So there is the componentry of just think about, you have call it where would be present-day Baghdad and just the Iraq and Iran area. If you were going to constitute a number of people coming into that area, you would want to also displace some. And one of the things that is common in ancient history when somebody would conquer a group of people would be, what do you do with them? Okay, do you barbarically torture them? Do you displace them? Do you topple their wall? Do you topple their livelihood? Do you burn their crops? Do you keep life for them impossible? Well, that was the way of many. Persia is a little different. The Syrians and the Babylonians were more like what I just described. The Persians were a little different when they would conquer and defeat an area. They would establish vassal cities, which wasn't original to them, but they used it commonly. And they would think that it's better to leave people empowered, leave them with crops, leave them with walls, leave them with things that they are able to continue life with. That allegiance to you is better if they have these. So Cyrus is trying to send some of these Jews out of that Persia area. We call it Persia today, but it's Iran today. But back then it was in Babylon, and before that it was the Chaldeans. But they're trying to push them back to Jerusalem and trying to establish kind of a favorable vassal kind of leadership or covering over them, so to say. And so if we keep going in chapter 2, we're going to find out the priests, the Levites, the singers, gatekeepers, temple servants, they've gone back. They settle in their own towns along with some of the other people, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their towns. Now let's lean on that. So we know that these priests, Levites, and singers, they would have settled around Jerusalem. That's where the temple was to be. Up on Mount Moriah, that's where Jerusalem is built. It's where the first temple had been. That's where they were going to build the second temple. And then you have other people who are amongst Judah who are going to populate in their hometowns or their family line's hometown in the surrounding area. Like Bethlehem would be one of those. It's only about 5 miles or so from Jerusalem. Easy to get to, but still not in Jerusalem. You'd have a number of people surrounding in the Judah area. And they get settled into their life. Keeping the summary of Ezra going here, when the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. So they're coming back. Then Joshua, now in the book of Haggai, the same name is going to be spelled as Joshua, as you and I know. It's the same person. So I'm going to say it as Joshua because that's what we're going to see in Haggai. Joshua, son of Josazak, and I'm probably butchering that name, and his fellow priest Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, probably butchering that name, and his associates, began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses. Now, let me say a couple things there. Once again, the first thing to return to the altar. And we'll build the temple following, but we want to rebuild the altar. Well, you have Joshua, who is over the priests, so he is overseeing this, and then Zerubbabel is assigned by Cyrus to be the governor of these people. That means that he has to keep them safe, and he also has to keep allegiance back with Persia. It is his responsibility to pay the dues. It is his responsibility to keep them safe and protected. And it is Joshua's responsibility to reinstitute the sacrifices and the building of the temple. Okay? And the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to do burnt offerings. So that goes to Leviticus chapter 1, just a very small history reminder. As Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy ends, the tabernacle had been built, the presence of God fills the tabernacle, and Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1, God tells Moses, okay, if y'all are going to come to me and bring me offerings, korban was what it was, then here's how you do it. And the first offering was a burnt offering. So he's going to, what they are doing is reestablishing the process of Leviticus in coming before the Lord. But watch what happens. Verse 3, despite their fears of the people around them, they built the altar on its foundation, sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Now, the reason that I think that's important is you got to understand that while they're doing this, those that had remained in the Jerusalem, Judah area that maybe weren't Jewish or even wicked in their, kind of disposition, they wouldn't have been excited about this 50,000 people coming back to rebuild temple. Like if they were warlords, if they were people that controlled the area, they wouldn't have wanted anybody moving in. That's exactly what Nehemiah is going to face when he comes to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. Tobiah and Sanballat are going to oppose him. Why? Because, hey, who's this guy coming into what we have taken possession of? You think about present day when somebody buys property in a quiet, off the beaten path area. They love it, love it, love it. And then they start to see all these construction trucks coming in and new neighborhoods coming in. And they're like, wait a minute. Who's coming into our peace and quiet? Run them off, run them off, run them off. It's that kind of concept. Who's coming into Jerusalem and trying to take back over? And so there's threat and danger. That's going to show up big time in Haggai. So go into chapter 3, continuing on. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But watch this. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. So of the people that come into Jerusalem, some of them, it was their first time ever being in that area. They'd never seen the temple. They had never seen the glory of what Solomon had built. They knew nothing of it, only by word of mouth. So they rejoiced. But once again, they had been in captivity only 70 years. Some people that had been young in the temple are now coming, and they're weeping because they're saying this is not as grand as what Solomon had built. And so there's this contention. If you imagine just the footers, I don't know if you've ever had the privilege of watching a house or a building being built and all that's in place is the footers. You think, this isn't going to be enough. I remember when we built this building for Bridgeway, when the footers got poured, I privately was like, oh my goodness, it's way too small. And I had some people say that to me. They're like, Joel, we're building too small. We won't be able to put people in there. And I'm like, look, we got to trust the measurements. It's going to be right. And it has been right for us. It's been the right size. We can hold a lot of people. But when you just saw the footers, it looks a different way. That's what's happening here. And God in the book of Haggai is going to answer his glory being in that which looks different. So let me keep going so that we can get to Haggai. It says, no one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away. Now let's keep going. We're almost done with Ezra. Ezra chapter 4, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel. Why? He's the governor. Remember, Joshua's over the priestly realm and the worship. Who's in charge of this place? Who has the rights? Who has the resources? Well, it's Zerubbabel. By way of who? King Cyrus. He's the one that sent with decree. But you will find that Cyrus ends up dying and Darius is going to end up becoming the guy. So they come to Zerubbabel. Then watch him in chapter 4, verse 4. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They asked to help them, and Zerubbabel says no, and they set out to intimidate them and to discourage them. It's exactly what happens with Nehemiah, same kind of concept. They hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So when Cyrus dies and there's a new king in town, which wasn't Darius, there's one in between, you'll see that in a bit. It's like, okay, do you still have the resources? Do you still have the authority? You want to talk about fear being at level 10 for Zerubbabel and all the people there? It'd have been at level 10. That's what's going to cause them to stop working on the temple. That's what's going to cause God to raise up Haggai and to say, get back to work. So, chapter 5, verse 1, and then we're headed to Haggai. Now, Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. And their prophecy is going to be, guys, let's get back to work. Let's do what God has called us and assigned us. This came from God, not from Cyrus. This comes from God and is stamped by God, not from Darius, who would eventually be the king of Persia. And so the book of Haggai comes in the midst of that groundwork. So with that, now let's jump over to Haggai. Once again, this is 2 chapters, and he is talking to the context that we just looked at, okay? So Haggai chapter 1, verse 1, in the 2nd year of King Darius. So I'm going to show you some time in just a second. Remember, Cyrus sends them to Jerusalem, and then there's another king in between, very short-lived, and then Darius. And in the 2nd year of Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, Haggai identifies dates better than almost any prophet. I think you could say he is the best at all the prophets of identifying dates. So we're going to see a lot of dates here. The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai, once again, to Zerubbabel and to Joshua, the one over the priests and the one who's the governor. Now this is coming on year number 2 of Darius, month number 6, day number 1. Now just keep that in mind as we follow along. So let me show you. King Cyrus ruled Persia from about 560 to 530. Good period of time. So we know there's that collapse of Nebuchadnezzar pretty quickly after Israel's there. There's Belshazzar, who will follow. We read about that in Daniel chapter 4 to chapter 5. And then in chapter 5, at the end of Daniel chapter 5, the Babylonians fall to the Medo-Persians, and you would have Cyrus entering into leadership. You would have this period where he's the ruler there. He's going to eventually send them back. You have another king that's going to be following Cyrus for a short bit, and then King Darius. In 522, he is the one who comes into power. So we know in that 2nd year that it is most likely that Haggai is speaking in 520 BC. So that'll come to us at the end of this writing. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So keep going. Verse 2, this is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now pause. I'm going to come back to this, but I want to go back to our dates for just a second. Remember, some point in the rulership of King Cyrus, they get sent, right? Let's just say it's the last year, 530. You still have King Cambyses, where you have this 8 years. So you have a period of time in which the Jewish people have come back to Jerusalem in that first, or in a very short period of 3 months or whatever it was, and they reconvene in Jerusalem as one man. They've resettled, they come back with the purpose, but then there's fear, there's intimidation, and it stops. And it doesn't stop for a week, and it doesn't stop for months, it stops for years. And they go into the process of reestablishing their lives and reestablishing harvest and reestablishing all the things while the temple of God in Jerusalem stays unfinished, maybe even unattended to. And God says, okay, enough of that, raises up Haggai. And Haggai's first statement, you're saying it's not a good time. It's been years. Is it a time for you to be living in paneled houses while God's house lies in ruins? Continuing on in verse 5, it says this, he says, now this is what the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your ways. That's a key statement that gets used multiple times. Give careful thought to your ways. You've planted much, but have harvested little. Once again, they've had years of planting now. They've had, call it a decade or close to a decade of planting, and you're not seeing anything productive. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. Pause. You eat and you drink are statements about their crops and about their vineyards, about vines not producing. They're talking about wine, they're talking about grapes, and they're talking about crops, wheat. And he's saying your crops aren't producing and your vines aren't producing. You put on clothes but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. So let me say this. God had allowed lack. He had allowed lack to drive them into Let's prioritize God so that he'll bless us. But they didn't do it. So this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. The reason that you have the lack is you have not put me first. So he's telling them, you have got to return to me. Lack didn't teach him, so God raises a prophet. And he says, go up into the mountains, bring down timber, build the house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. Because God is saying, if you will build my house and I'm honored and I am first, then I'll bless your fields and I'll bless your vineyards. But I'm not going to bless them if you're not blessing me and prioritizing me. This is true from cover to cover in the Bible. Place the Lord first, he takes care of his people. Place the Lord at the back of the line, and he says, at some point I'm going to stop this show. And it continues on in verse 12. Then Zerubbabel and Joshua, I'm leaving out their dad's names, the high priest and the whole remnant of the people. So all the people were responding to Haggai. They obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. So they didn't fear the lack. They didn't fear the consequences of what they did or didn't have. They feared the fact that God was bringing a prophet. My opinion only. Once again, this is a group of people that had come out of Babylon, and they had heard of the prophets. They had heard of the prophets. They had heard of a people that rejected Amos, and a people that rejected Micah, and a people that rejected Obadiah, and a people that rejected Isaiah and Jeremiah. People that had rejected repenting and turning when the prophets had arisen. And now God raises a prophet. He is the first prophet that they are seeing since Daniel and Ezekiel in the midst of captivity. And they're like, oh snap. So they fear the Lord and they respond. So follow this. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. Now, why is that important? That line right there is so critical. It was critical for them, and it's critical for you and me. Because what had stopped them? Fear. Fear because of all the people and the danger that were threatening them. And the thing that we were still going to be confronted by was danger. And so fear was going to be there. What answers fear? What answers danger? When God says, I'm with you. This isn't about you having the authority papers from Cyrus or from Darius. This is about you knowing that I'm with you. And God often, for you and me, will tell us, remind us, I'm with you. We have a job situation, health situation, family situation. Those are just common, but a variety of different situations that cause fear for us. And God reminds us. He doesn't change everything sometimes. He just tells you, I'm with you. It's exactly what Haggai says to the people, so that they will be motivated and strengthened. So watch their response. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the spirit of Joshua, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty their God. So they were stirred by knowing, not that we're safe from everybody, but that God is with us. And then it says, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. So, remember when this had started? Day 1. Year 2 of Darius, 6th month, day 1. Now we're at 24. It takes them about 3 weeks. It takes them about 3 weeks to get going. It takes them about 3 weeks to get to this point of receptivity and movement. So we have, just kind of looking at it, day 1 to day 24. Now, once again, I said there's parallels. When you look at Nehemiah, when you watch Nehemiah, Nehemiah's group starts work on the wall at a later point. And because he's going to hear that the wall still is in shambles, and he's going to come. They're going to begin their work. And then the Bible says that 26 days, or when it was half its height. They completed the wall in 52 days. When it was half its height, the strength of the men gave out. It's interesting that it takes about a month. to get people motivated to do something, and it can take about a month for the energy and exhaustion to wane, where people are like, okay, I'm at the end of myself. But we keep going, and now we're into chapter 2, and God is telling them that he's going to bless them on the 21st day of the 7th month. So we've got about another month. So my opinion is there's a weariness now, there's activity. Maybe the fear has returned. That's what I think is happening, where fear got answered with I'm with you. Now we're almost a month, basically a month away down the road again, and fear has returned. Have you ever been like pressed in your own life where you're like, why does fear return, or why does anxiety return for me? Well, I can't answer that. It's pretty normal, but you'll find that God answers the same way. He will remind you once again, I'm with you. So watch this. The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, speak to Joshua, speak to the remnant of people in the red part. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? Now that only makes sense if we remember what happened in Ezra. The wailing because the footers and it looked too small. It doesn't look like Solomon's. Remember, because this is so connected to Solomon. Solomon's temple was glorious, and the Bible is very clear that in the era of Solomon there was peace. And so with the temple and the glorious temple of Solomon, of the Lord, it's like that's an era of peace. It brings peace, all those things. But now if we don't have the glory and we don't have the temple, then we won't have peace. That's exactly what God is going to answer to. But now be strong, O Zerubbabel. Be strong, Joshua. Be strong, O you people, for I am with you. He reminds them a month down the road again. I'm with you. I'm your God. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Don't fear. Fear triggers when we don't think God is with us. Fear is answered when we remember God's with us in this. But watch, he's going to continue, and this is going towards answering the Solomon scenario. This is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and dry land. I'll shake the nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. Like when this is done, I'm going to shake the nations, I'm going to provide for it, and I'm going to fill this with glory. I'm going to fill this temple with glory, and I'm going to fill the earth with glory. Watch. The silver is mine. The gold is mine. All the world. It's all mine. Declares the Lord. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. That is so incredibly powerful. Because, once again, what would have been the fear and concern of Joshua if he's over the priests and he's over the temple and the building of this temple? Will God's glory fill this temple? God's glory filled the tabernacle. God's glory filled Solomon's temple. Will God's glory fill our temple? And anytime you had God's glory, you had the peace of God. You had peace and help against enemies. And there's a great concern for Joshua and now Zerubbabel, who is the governor. He is to oversee their protection, their provision, their safety. He's worried about how do we finance this? How do we protect everybody? And God is saying, I'll take care of all of it if you'll just build my house and you put me first. So keep going. It says in verse 10, it says on the 24th day of the 9th month, so we can see this progression of time, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. So we're in year 2 of Darius, month 9, day 24. Watch this because this is going to get good. In verse 18, it says, from this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. He keeps coming. I think about this. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Their answer would have been no. Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree have not borne fruit. Remember, their lands hadn't been blessed. But God is saying from this day on, I'll bless you. If you'll put me first, you'll build my house, my glory will be there, and I'll provide everything you need. I'll bless you. Watch. Man, this is good. Then the word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel. What's Zerubbabel concerned about? Protection, provision. He needs Darius's help. And there's this question, will we continue to be protected from the one who authorized us to come? We don't have a wall to protect us yet. We don't have a military to protect us yet. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, I will shake the nations and the earth. I'll overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. I'll overthrow chariots, their drivers, horses, and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. I'll be your warrior. You won't have a military, I'll be your military. Each by the sword of his brother. I'll turn them against one another. And he says, on that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I'll make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. And that's how the book of Haggai ends. So what is he saying here? He is saying, you've been dependent on the signet ring of Cyrus. You've been dependent on the signet ring of Darius. That's your only provision. That's your only authority. And he's saying, if you guys, Joshua and Zerubbabel and all the people, if you'll build my house, my glory will be there. It'll be greater than anything you've ever seen. I'll bring peace to your land. I'll provide crops. I'll provide your vineyards. I'll give you all the provision you need. And Zerubbabel, because you're concerned about these things as to protection and provision, you'll be my signet ring. You'll have my authority. You'll have my approval. I'll be the one that resources it all. Up until this point, they'd kind of looked to the Lord, but kind of looked to Persia. And God is depicting, no, I'm the God of this territory. I'm the God of my people, and I'll be the one that provides. Now, we would see, as you last see, the temple was completed in 516 BC, and we're going to see that back in Ezra chapter 6. How there's a dedication ceremony, and so we can see that the people did it. But it's a fascinating study when you look at the book of Haggai to understand this connection between Haggai and Ezra, and Zechariah is a contemporary. So Zechariah covers 14 chapters. We're going to have a lot to cover in our next study, but you're going to find some of the same groundwork. It's post-exile. They've returned. God is saying, would you put me first? And they had had years of just kind of not doing that. God is going to send them a prophet, which gets them fired up because they're like, we've seen prophets before or heard of prophets before in the rejection of prophets. They're going to be motivated to act. And God is saying, I'll bless you. You'll have my peace. Why? Because my presence is there, and I'll protect you in all things. So that is a look at the 2 chapters of book of Haggai. And I hope you'll join me as we get into the book of Zechariah in our next study. God bless you.